Hey, how's it going? I'm happy to say that I was recently able to borrow this Rickenbacker 4003 bass. I really like the sound of Rickenbackers, and outside of the Fender P and J and the Stingray, it's arguably the fourth most famous bass. Unfortunately though, this is a somewhat expensive instrument, and I can't really afford to own one long term. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. I used the Rick as a model to create this bass. This is just a humble Squier Sonic Precision bass that I picked up new a little while ago for very little money, and all I did was buy actual Rick bass pickups, which fortunately Rickenbacker sells directly, and then mount them in the exact same positions as the Rick. So just like with the Stingray, same pickups, same positions. Then I replaced the controls to match Rick controls, and lastly, I put matching strings on both basses and made sure to set them up identically. That's really it. Alright, enough talking. Does this match the sound? Let's find out. Here's a quick test. At any given time, one of these two basses will be playing. See if you can hear when the changes happen and which bass is playing at all times. We'll just start with the bridge pickup only. Here we go. Alright, feel free to go back and listen again if you'd like. But if you're ready, actually the entire sample was this bass, the Squier. None of it was the Rickenbacker. Okay, please bear with me. I promise that's the only trick question in this entire video. The reason I did that was this. If you're like me, you'd be listening for subtle variations each time that riff is played. And I can absolutely hear differences, but it was all because I can't play any given riff literally exactly the same each time. The point here is, that clip you just heard is the level of completely normal variation you should expect to hear from the other clips in this video, even when you're hearing the same bass. In other words, if we're truly saying that one bass sounds different from the other, the tonal variation needs to be significantly more than what you just heard. Okay, enough of that. No more tricks, I promise. This time, we'll hear bridge pickup, both pickups, and neck pickup, and it really will switch between these two basses at certain points. Here we go. Okay, again, feel free to go back if you'd like. But if you're ready, here's which bass was playing. Now, before you make a final judgment, the first thing I thought when I did this test myself was it would really help to hear the same part of that riff back to back. So let's make this super simple. Here's literally just the first note of the riff extracted from multiple samples. If you heard those previous samples and thought maybe you were starting to hear a consistent tonal difference between the basses, well, see what you think of these. All right, again, if there's any significant difference between the sounds of these basses, it should be obvious enough to pretty easily tell the difference, regardless of the quantity or order of the samples. Okay, if you're ready, here's the answer. All right, I have a much more extensive sound comparison coming up. Feel free to skip to it, but real quick, I kind of fooled myself into thinking there was maybe a little tonal difference between the basses. That was until I did the second test with the single notes back to back, and I realized the differences I thought I heard weren't which bass was playing, it was how I happened to play the riff that time around. Personally, my own attempt to pick out the right bass was just completely wrong, meaning I absolutely couldn't tell which was which. Definitely see what you think though. If you actually honestly could tell when the changes happened, and you did always get the correct bass, hey, wow, very nice work. But maybe the most important question is, was the difference really major enough that you said, okay, yeah, it's obvious that those specific parts were a genuine Rickenbacker bass, but man, everything else sounded like some really cheap bass with different pickups slapped on? Or was any difference minor enough that it could easily be comparing any given Rickenbacker 4003 to another Rickenbacker 4003? If your answer was, yeah, everything sounded like a Rickenbacker, I'd invite you to keep watching. Not even necessarily for copying the sound of a Rick specifically, but also just for the general principle of what's actually important if you're trying to capture the sound of a particular electric bass, or guitar for that matter. Plus, I have a little surprise in the next sound samples if you're really interested in saving money. You know, so I don't have to keep calling it the Squier Sonic Precision with Rick pickups, which is pretty cumbersome to say. I thought I should give this bass some kind of name. First, I thought about Squierbacker or Rickensquacker, but as a rock star, I can't be seen playing a bass with a ridiculous sounding name like that. So I went with Squickenbacker. Anyway, let's get to the big question. Why do this? At least for this specific bass. Well, first of all, if you can afford a Rickenbacker and you're okay with the adjustability and ergonomics, by all means, buy a real Rickenbacker, support the company. But if what you're after is primarily the sound, then maybe something like the Squickenbacker here is for you. And in a few ways, a Rickenbacker is actually an ideal case for doing something like this. Because based on lots of forum posts and reviews for Rick basses, a lot of players tend to say that, for sure, one of the biggest pros of Ricks is the sound. But a few of the cons are, number one, cost. This bass is over 10 times the cost of this one. Yeah, not saying it's not worth it, that's subjective, but definitely a big consideration. Number two and number three, difficult adjustability and unusual ergonomics. I'll spare you most of the details, but Ricks are kind of notorious for these things. They've been slowly getting a bit better, but setting up and playing a Rick will make you realize just how much you took for granted because Fender got it so right back in the beginning, and most other companies copied these things. Rickenbacker, though, just kept doing their own thing. So by making a bass like this, you can get the best of both worlds. The sound of the Rick, but with whatever body and neck you prefer. I like Squiers simply because they're cheap, easily adjustable and customizable, and they have that familiar feel of a Fender bass. So all three of the downsides are eliminated. Now, I will add that one thing I love about Rickenbackers is the look. That's also pretty subjective, but admittedly, if you really want that too, it does reduce your body and neck options. You can probably tell though, I added a few things to make it look a little more like a Rick. That was just for fun, it doesn't impact the sound. But one thing you could do is look for a Rick knockoff. They've been around from various brands since at least the 70s, and you could save a few bucks there. There may be some models that also improve on some of the drawbacks like adjustability. I'm not sure, you'd have to look around. Anyway, let's take a more detailed listen to sound samples. Each of these will go through all 5 pickup settings with tone on full so we can hear everything as clearly as possible. Both basses have identical round wound strings, but at the beginning of each set, We'll actually start with this 1973 precision bass strung with labella deep talkin' flat wound strings. This will give us a completely different sound on purpose. That way, we'll know that any audio processing isn't somehow making all of the basses sound the same. Real quick, I mentioned 5 pickup settings. This is a Rickenbacker 4003, and it's really just an updated version of the original Rick 4001. When I say Rickenbacker bass, I'm really referring to both the 4001 and 4003. There are other Rick bass models, but they're much less common. The 4001 and 4003 are essentially the same, but one key difference is that the 4001 had an interesting design where the bridge pickup had an extra capacitor wired in, which deliberately cut out the lower frequencies. They probably did this to give the two pickups as much tonal variation as possible. The neck pickup is already really bassy because it's so close to the neck, actually a lot closer than most other popular bass models, as you can see here, so most likely Rickenbacker wanted the bridge pickup to be as thin as possible for maximum contrast. That's one reason Ricks are often associated with a particularly bright, cutting tone, because many players liked the unusually aggressive sound of the bridge pickup. The 4003 added a push-pull pot that would activate that capacitor as an option instead. I think they refer to it as the vintage tone, meaning the sound of the 4001 bass. I wouldn't have bothered including it in the sound samples, except it really does make a pretty huge difference to the sound of both the bridge pickup alone and the neck bridge combination. So you'll hear a comparison of 5 settings, not just 3. Now, you might recall, I promised an extra surprise if you're interested in saving even more money, because while these Rick pickups aren't super expensive, combined, they're about the same cost as this bass itself, and sometimes they can be hard to find if they're out of stock at Rickenbacker, which the bridge pickup was as of recording this. Oh, by the way, specifically this neck pickup is a Rickenbacker 00001, and this bridge pickup is a 00003. So just for fun, I bought the cheapest pickups I could find on AliExpress that were reasonably similar, meaning single coil, Alnico, somewhat similar DC resistance. These were about $15 each, super inexpensive. Then I temporarily replaced the pickups in the Rickenbacker here with these, set up the pickup heights identically, and recorded samples with these too. So what we'll hear from each set of samples is first the precision bass, then the Rickenbacker with pickups in exactly the right locations, but super cheap non-Rickenbacker pickups. Then the Rickenbacker with the correct Rick pickups. And finally, the actual Rickenbacker 4003. Then we'll go through the other pickup combinations, but just without the precision bass. Okay, here we go. Now, as usual, I don't want to say too much about my own thoughts on the sounds, but very high level, for the Rickenbacker with Rick pickups versus the actual Rickenbacker, same as with the Stingray experiment, I randomly shuffled up a bunch of clips between these two, and even though I played the samples myself, there's no way I'd ever be able to tell which clip was from which bass. I couldn't even tell that the bass had switched from one clip to another. That's just me. I'll keep it to just that, but see what you think. As for the super cheap pickups, I thought they sounded great. They obviously sounded different, but I think by getting them in exactly the right positions, you can go a long way to capturing the basic flavor of a Rickenbacker. If I heard it in a mix by itself, I might even assume it was a Rickenbacker. And actually, I could see some people preferring the brighter sound of these pickups. I know they look terrible in this bass since the pickup routes are for the Rick pickups, obviously, but if you routed it correctly in the first place, it'd look totally fine. Although, in a way, I kind of like how punk this bass looks with the wrong pickups. Anyway, if you're interested in doing a project like this of your own to get the Rickenbacker sound, here are some thoughts and tips. Here is a wiring diagram of a Rick 4003. For the most part, it's basically the same as a Gibson Les Paul, in that it has 2 volumes, 2 tones, and a pickup selector switch. But beyond that, there's the vintage tone switch I mentioned earlier here, which is optional. You could also either permanently wire it in for the 4001 sound, or simply leave it out for the more modern 4003 sound. But notice this, 330 kiloohm potentiometers. This is an unusual value. Standard guitar and bass pots are usually 250K or 500K. It's not completely clear why Rickenbacker chose this value, but if you want to buy them yourself, just a heads up that they're significantly more expensive. Plus, if you want to do concentric pots like I did here, 330K pots really are not available. So I did some circuit analysis in a program called LT Spice, and it turns out that changing the volume pot to either 250K or 500K makes practically no change to the tone at all. So you can feel pretty safe with any of these values. No need to pay extra. Now, what about the tone pot? Well, with the tone all the way up at or near 100%, here again, it doesn't really matter. It's only when you turn the tone down that differences start to appear. As you turn down the tone, a lower value like 250K cuts out more of the high end for any given position of the knob. Personally, in the end, I use these concentric pots I found online that have a 500K and 250K stacked together. For each pickup, I have the 500K as the volume and 250K as the tone. But with the tone fully open like I have it in all the demos in this video, I'm guessing there wouldn't be any audible difference for any combination of these values, even if you reversed them. And I really only use these concentric pots because the P-bass body has limited space for controls. If you're using a different body with more room for controls, you'd have more flexibility in selecting whatever values you want. Now, one specific note about the stock wiring schematic. You'll often see schematics showing 330K pots for all 4 of the volume and tone knobs. But here's the thing, for the 4003 model, I think this may actually be wrong. This particular 4003 definitely has a 500K pot here for the bridge pickup tone control. I couldn't find much info on this, but at least a couple of other forum posters confirmed their basses are the same as well. My best guess is that the original 4001 basses may indeed have used all 330K pots, and this is why most people still think that this is the correct schematic. But when Rickenbacker added this push-pull vintage tone switch in the 4003, they had a problem because, to my knowledge, 330K is not a standard rating for push-pull pots, and getting them custom-made probably would have been really expensive. So Rickenbacker just went with a very standard 500K push-pull pot instead. It'll be a tad bit brighter at the lowest tone settings, but Rickenbacker probably figured most players aren't trying to get a super dark sound from the bridge pickup anyway, and no one would care about the very minor difference. Now that's a total guess, but in any case, as far as I can tell, 500K is actually the correct value for a 4003 bass's tone control. Now speaking of that vintage tone switch, Since I used concentric pots on my bass, push-pull wasn't an option. So I just used a separate mini switch here for the vintage tone selector. Again, you don't have to include it, but I really like it, and it's super simple to add. Now, if you're familiar with Rickenbacker's Rico sound output options, which allow either mono or stereo output options via the 2 output jacks, yes, you can accomplish this with just one output jack. I wired up a stereo output jack, but added this other mini switch to select either stereo output, meaning each pickup goes out to a separate channel, or mono, meaning no separation between left and right in stereo. I didn't use stereo for the sound demos in this video, but there are plenty of other videos online demonstrating this, so go check those out if you're curious about what Rico sound is all about. If you're interested, here is the complete wiring diagram for the Rickenbacker, this bass. This probably isn't all in standard notation, so apologies for that, but hopefully it's understandable enough to figure out what's what. Now, one note on scale length. Earlier in the video, I mentioned matching the Rick's pickup positions. Now, if you're a nerd like me, you probably thought to yourself, wait a minute, that Squier P has a standard 34-inch scale, but Rick basses are known for having that unusual 33.25-inch scale length. You are absolutely right, and the key is to get them in proportionally the same locations. So here on the screen are the distances to the centers of the pickups I measured from the 12th fret, and then the same distances scaled up by a ratio of 34 to 33.25 to compensate. Saves you a bit of math if you'd like to do this project, but bigger picture, I just wanted to illustrate this principle of adjusting between different scale lengths. Lastly, one special thing about Rick basses I actually think is kind of fascinating, which also raises interesting questions about design philosophy. The famous Rickenbacker bridge pickup. It has a cover, which originally was a functional part of the pickup, but for decades now, it doesn't do anything. It's just there to maintain the original aesthetic. Looks super cool, but the location really blocks your playing hand, right where you'd probably want to put it. What this forces you to do is play on one side or the other. But really, it's not easy to play on the bridge side. Thanks to this weird bridge design where the strings are recessed down below the top, there's less space available than it looks like. The surprisingly sharp edges will punish your fingers if you're not very careful playing fingerstyle. And with a pick, not only is there not quite enough room, but the bridge makes it really difficult to palm mute. So the only logical choice is to play right up near the neck. Maybe this is what Rickenbacker intended? Regardless, as we bass players know, the lower tension of the strings near the neck generally tends to create a more aggressive pizzicato kind of sound. A good example of this might be Geddy Lee's playing style. It's also still difficult to palm mute if you're using a pick because now it's the pickup cover that's in the way. So whenever I play it with a pick, I tend to always end up with a snappy, sharp attack with no muting to soften it at all. You probably heard it in the samples. Like I said earlier, the sound of this bridge pickup is a major part of the Rick's reputation as a rock bass. But it's kind of fascinating to think that the very ergonomics of the bass also encourage you to play it in a certain style. And that may have also impacted people's perception of what type of music this bass is good for. As another example, I see the same thing in alembic basses of the 70s. All of their basses had the strings shifted so far away from your plucking hand that pretty much the only place you could comfortably play it fingerstyle was right up next to the bridge. Unless you're Stanley Clarke, but he had a pretty unusual right-hand technique anyway. And accordingly, alembics have a reputation for sounding very articulate and precise, which is exactly the kind of sound you'd tend to get anyway if you're playing right near the bridge. Now, all this is just a theory, and in both of these cases is just one out of several factors, but I do think it's interesting that simple ergonomics alone might at least encourage players to use a particular technique. I have no idea if either company did this intentionally, but as a design principle, maybe this could be a very real strategy. If you want to make sure your customers use your product in a particular way, design it so that it's difficult for them to use it any other way. Kind of interesting to think about. By the way, I bet a lot of you non-Rick owners may be yelling at me right now to just take the cover off. You'd think this would be easy. There are just a couple of screws here, right? Nope, you need to remove the strings and completely disassemble the pickup assembly. Then reverse all your steps to put it back together. All right, we're done, right? Nope, your pickup will now need to be readjusted to the original height settings if you want it to sound the same as before. Hope you remembered to get a ruler and write down the original settings before you started. All right, good to go now. Problem solved, right? Nope, they're not. Now there's a surprisingly huge gaping hole all around the pickup where your fingers will get caught. And yet another set of weirdly sharp edges right where your fingers will hit them. Trust me, I'm not exaggerating. If you're not very careful to avoid them, it will hurt. The best solution is to get a device called a bezel that's specifically designed to fill up this Rick bridge cavity. This one's from a company called Treble Bezel that's really popular. There are some from other companies too. I highly recommend doing this unless you really don't mind leaving the original cover on. In fact, I just found out Rickenbacker themselves now make their own bridge pickup ring, and even a version with the bridge pickup included, which is model number 00006. Looks like a good option too. But anyway, remember how I mentioned ergonomics are one of the biggest drawbacks of Rick basses? Well, this bridge pickup is one of the more notorious examples. And don't even get me started on the original bridge design, which fortunately this bass doesn't have. Rickenbacker. You guys created one of the coolest looking and coolest sounding basses ever, but sometimes I think you've just been trolling us all along. Anyway, hope this gave you some ideas if you're looking to add some Rickenbacker sounds to your bass. I know I'm pumped to have this one moving forward. Thanks for watching. Happy playing.